The most expensive mistake a leader can make is believing they can measure a person's worth with a single question. The lunch crowd at Hawthorne House moved with the quiet rhythm of polished silverware, soft conversations, and million-dollar negotiations disguised as casual meals. Every table carried a different story, but every eye seemed to follow one man the moment he stepped through the revolving doors. Ethan Whitmore, the white-haired CEO of Whitmore Dynamics, had built a reputation that reached far beyond Manhattan. Investors admired him. Competitors feared him. Employees respected him from a careful distance. His success had come from making fast decisions, trusting sharp instincts, and believing that credentials never lied. If a resume impressed him, the person usually did. If it did not, he rarely looked twice. Naomi Brooks noticed him the same way she noticed every guest who entered the restaurant. Calmly, professionally, without excitement or hesitation. At 29, the black waitress had mastered the quiet art of becoming invisible whenever necessary. She greeted each customer with the same warm smile, carried every tray with effortless balance, and never interrupted conversations that clearly belonged to worlds much larger than her own. Her neatly pressed black uniform blended into the elegant dining room, making it easy for people to overlook the intelligence quietly observing everything around her. As Ethan settled into his usual corner table with several members of his executive team, conversations about quarterly forecasts and acquisition strategies floated through the air. Naomi approached with a leather menu and a glass of sparkling water. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore. Welcome back." Ethan barely looked up from the documents spread across the table. His attention remained fixed on highlighted reports covered with charts and handwritten notes. One board member chuckled while another adjusted his reading glasses, preparing for what sounded like another routine business lunch. Naomi waited patiently, pen resting lightly against her order pad. Silence never bothered her. It often revealed more than words ever could. Ethan finally lifted his eyes. For just a second, his expression lingered on the name stitched neatly above her uniform pocket. Naomi Brooks. Then his gaze moved back to the reports. "Do you even have a degree?" he asked without changing his tone, as though the question were no more important than asking about the weather. The table grew strangely quiet. One executive smiled awkwardly. Another looked down at his coffee, pretending not to notice. Nearby diners slowed their conversations just enough to listen without appearing obvious. Naomi remained perfectly still. Her hand never trembled. Her smile never disappeared. She simply met Ethan's eyes with a calm that felt almost impossible to explain. It was not the calm of someone who had no answer. It was the calm of someone who understood that timing could be more powerful than words. Somewhere beyond the restaurant windows, afternoon sunlight reflected against the glass towers of Midtown, while inside, the silence between a CEO and a waitress became heavier than anyone at the table expected. No one realized that a single question had just begun a story that would soon follow them far beyond the dining room, and into a place where titles, uniforms, and assumptions would all be tested. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet it lingered over the table long after Naomi stepped away with the drink orders written neatly across her pad. Ethan returned to the financial reports in front of him as though nothing unusual had happened, but several members of the executive team exchanged brief glances before burying themselves in their own notes. They had worked beside Ethan for years. They understood his habits. He challenged people the way other executives shook hands. Sometimes he did it to uncover talent. More often, he did it because he believed pressure revealed the truth. Across the dining room, Naomi moved from one table to another with the same quiet confidence she had displayed moments earlier. She remembered every special request without writing it down, noticed an elderly customer reaching for an empty water glass before he asked, and gently reminded the kitchen about a guest with a severe food allergy. Nothing about her movements appeared rushed. Every step seemed measured. Every smile felt genuine rather than rehearsed. New employees often struggled to keep pace inside Hawthorne House. Naomi never seemed to. Daniel, the restaurant manager, watched her from the hostess station with quiet appreciation. He had hired dozens of servers over the years, but very few possessed Naomi's unusual combination of grace and discipline. She never complained about difficult guests. She never argued over schedules. She simply arrived early, worked hard, and left after making certain every detail had been completed. Even so, There remained something about her that Daniel could never quite explain. It was not only the way she spoke. It was the way she listened. While others heard conversations, Naomi seemed to understand them. Back at Ethan's table, the discussion shifted toward an important presentation scheduled later that afternoon at company headquarters. The board of directors would gather to review a proposed acquisition that had consumed months of preparation. Charts covered the table beside untouched coffee cups. Deadlines, projections, and shareholder expectations blended into a familiar language of corporate urgency. Ethan studied a spreadsheet before frowning almost imperceptibly. One number refused to match the surrounding calculations. He tapped the page with the end of his pen, but said nothing. One executive suggested updating the assumptions. Another blamed the finance department for inconsistent reporting. The conversation drifted in circles without finding an answer. Naomi approached, carrying their lunches with practiced precision. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, prime steak, and fresh bread arrived exactly where each guest expected. She placed the final plate in front of Ethan before quietly noticing the same spreadsheet still lying open beside his fork. Her eyes rested on it for less than a second, long enough to recognize the pattern, not long enough for anyone to realize she had seen it. She stepped back politely. Ethan reached for his glass before looking toward the report again. He still wore the expression of a man searching for something just beyond reach. Naomi lowered her eyes respectfully and turned to continue serving another table, leaving behind nothing except an almost invisible feeling that the lunch had become about far more than food. Upstairs, only a few blocks away, the boardroom lights would soon switch on, and the unanswered question resting silently beside Ethan's plate would follow every person seated at that table. By the time lunch ended, the elegant calm of Hawthorne House had given way to the relentless pace of a New York afternoon. Blacktown cars lined the curb outside as executives disappeared into glass towers carrying leather briefcases and unfinished conversations. Ethan Whitmore glanced once more at the spreadsheet before sliding it into a dark portfolio. Something about the missing figure continued to bother him. It was a tiny inconsistency, almost invisible, yet experience had taught him that billion-dollar mistakes often began with numbers everyone else ignored. 15 minutes later, the executive elevator opened directly onto the top floor of Whitmore Dynamics. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Manhattan skyline, while the boardroom slowly filled with directors, legal advisors, financial analysts, and senior vice presidents. Fresh coffee waited beside polished notebooks. Large presentation screens glowed with charts forecasting the future of the company. The atmosphere remained confident on the surface, but beneath every greeting rested quiet tension. Today's acquisition would become the largest expansion in the company's history. Failure was not an acceptable outcome. Ethan stood at the head of the table, greeting each board member with his usual composed authority. He trusted preparation. He trusted credentials. Every person seated around the polished walnut table represented decades of experience, advanced degrees, and distinguished careers. Yet as the chief financial officer began presenting revised projections, Ethan noticed the same unexplained discrepancy that had followed him from lunch. The numbers still refused to align. The room responded with careful theories. One executive blamed outdated market assumptions. Another suggested delaying the vote until additional reports could be prepared. A third recommended changing the valuation model entirely. Each explanation sounded intelligent. None felt convincing. Ethan remained silent, listening more than speaking. Outside the conference room, assistants moved quickly through the executive hallway delivering documents and arranging schedules for the afternoon. Downstairs in the lobby cafe, catered refreshments were being prepared for the board's scheduled break. Hawthorne House had been selected to provide the service because of its reputation for flawless attention to detail. Just before 2 o'clock, the catering team arrived with coffee, tea, pastries, and neatly arranged trays. Daniel supervised the delivery personally, while Naomi carried a tray of porcelain cups into the boardroom with the same steady composure she displayed inside the restaurant every day. Few people acknowledged her presence. Conversations about market conditions continued without interruption as she quietly refreshed coffee cups one by one. She neither hurried nor lingered. As she approached the presentation screen, her eyes naturally passed over the financial model displayed in bold blue columns. The formulas, assumptions, and projected cash flows appeared only for an instant before she lowered her gaze again. She continued placing cups with practiced precision, but something almost imperceptible changed behind her calm expression. One line on the screen did not agree with another. It was not dramatic. It was not obvious. It was simply wrong. Naomi finished serving the final cup and stepped back toward the doorway. Around the table, directors continued debating increasingly complicated solutions, never realizing that the smallest detail in the room had already been noticed by the one person they had completely overlooked. Naomi reached the doorway before quietly stopping beside the service cart. She looked once toward the presentation screen, then toward Daniel, who was organizing empty trays outside the boardroom. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Would it be inappropriate if I pointed out something I noticed?" Daniel gave her a puzzled look before lowering his voice. "Naomi, that room is filled with people who have spent months preparing this presentation." She nodded without the slightest trace of frustration. "I know. I only think one of the assumptions on the cash flow model may not match the growth rate they are using." Daniel hesitated. He had learned long ago that Naomi never interrupted anyone without a reason. Even so, this was the executive floor of one of the largest companies in the country. Every minute inside that room represented decisions worth millions of dollars. Before he could answer, the boardroom door opened. One of Ethan's assistants stepped into the hallway carrying several revised printouts. "Mr. Whitmore needs updated projections immediately," she said with obvious concern before hurrying toward the finance department. Daniel looked back at Naomi. "You really think you saw something?" Naomi answered with complete honesty. "I could be wrong. I only noticed that one assumption appears to be counted twice. If that is true, every projection after that line would be higher than it should be." Daniel studied her face. There was no arrogance, no desire for attention, only quiet certainty. Inside the boardroom, voices gradually became sharper. The chief financial officer defended the model while another director questioned the revised valuation. Every explanation seemed to create another unanswered question. Ethan remained standing near the presentation screen, listening carefully as confidence slowly gave way to uncertainty. The acquisition deadline could not be extended forever. Investors expected an answer before the market closed the following morning. The room had reached the point where everyone possessed impressive credentials, yet no one possessed a clear solution. Daniel took a slow breath before stepping toward the open doorway. "Mr. Whitmore," he said respectfully. The conversation paused. Ethan turned with visible impatience, expecting another logistical question about refreshments. "Yes." Daniel spoke carefully. "One member of my staff believes she noticed something on the financial model. I realize this may sound unusual, but she has an exceptional eye for details." A few board members exchanged amused smiles. One director quietly leaned back in his chair. Another folded his arms without attempting to hide his skepticism. Ethan looked beyond Daniel and immediately recognized Naomi, standing silently beside the service cart. For a brief moment, the memory of their conversation at lunch returned. His expression remained unreadable. Then one executive let out a restrained laugh. "We are asking the catering staff to review corporate acquisitions now." Another added, "Perhaps we should invite the valet to evaluate the legal documents as well." A few polite smiles appeared around the table, but Naomi did not react. She simply waited. Ethan studied her for another second before speaking in the same calm voice that had challenged her earlier that day. "Very well," he said. "If you believe you found something that every analyst in this room has overlooked, come in and show us exactly what you see." The room fell into complete silence as Naomi stepped across the threshold, carrying nothing except quiet confidence, while dozens of accomplished eyes followed her toward the glowing screen. Naomi walked toward the presentation screen without rushing, her footsteps almost silent against the polished hardwood floor. She stopped a respectful distance from the table and waited. Ethan gave a slight nod, signaling that she could speak. Every executive in the room watched with quiet disbelief. Some expected an awkward apology. Others anticipated a nervous guess that would end the interruption within seconds. Naomi looked at the financial model instead of the people around her. "May I ask one question before I say anything?" she said calmly. Ethan folded his arms. "Go ahead." Naomi pointed gently toward a column near the center of the screen. Was the projected customer retention increase already included when the recurring revenue forecast was calculated? The chief financial officer answered immediately. Yes, it was. Naomi nodded once. Then why is the same increase being applied again 3 rows later as an independent growth adjustment? The room became still. The chief financial officer turned toward the screen. His confident expression faded as he followed the highlighted figures. One analyst leaned forward and quietly opened his laptop. Another adjusted his glasses before comparing the projected formulas line by line. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Naomi remained exactly where she stood. She did not attempt to explain further. She simply waited for the numbers to speak for themselves. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards. Financial models refreshed. New calculations appeared almost instantly. The projected valuation shifted downward. Not dramatically enough to destroy the acquisition, but enough to change the entire negotiation strategy. Ethan stepped closer to the display, studying every line himself. He reviewed the assumptions once, then again, searching for an alternative explanation. There was none. The duplicated growth adjustment had quietly inflated the long-term forecast. It had survived weeks of meetings, countless reviews, and presentations prepared by some of the most accomplished professionals in the company. Yet it had been noticed in a matter of seconds by the woman who had entered the room carrying coffee cups. One board member slowly leaned back in his chair and released a breath he had apparently been holding. Another looked toward Naomi with open curiosity instead of skepticism. The earlier smiles had disappeared completely. Ethan turned toward the chief financial officer. How did we miss this? The question carried no anger, only genuine surprise. The chief financial officer shook his head. Everyone reviewed the model expecting to confirm it. Nobody looked at it with fresh eyes. Ethan remained silent for a moment before looking back at Naomi. For the first time since they had met that afternoon, he studied her without seeing the uniform she wore. He saw someone who had observed quietly, spoken carefully, and challenged an entire boardroom with nothing more than a simple question. Naomi lowered her hands and offered a small, respectful smile. I am sorry if I interrupted your meeting, she said softly. I only thought the numbers deserved another look. No one laughed this time. No one whispered another joke. The room had become unusually quiet because every person present understood the same uncomfortable truth. Intelligence had entered the boardroom long before anyone had bothered to recognize it. No one asked Naomi to leave. Instead, the boardroom remained suspended in a silence that felt entirely different from the one she had walked into only moments earlier. It was no longer the silence of doubt. It was the silence that followed an unexpected truth. Ethan slowly closed the presentation on the main screen before turning toward the analysts seated along the far side of the table. Run the model again, he said evenly. Remove the duplicate adjustment and rebuild the forecast from the beginning. The analysts immediately began working, their keyboards replacing conversation with a steady rhythm of quiet concentration. Within minutes, updated charts appeared across every monitor in the room. The revised valuation confirmed exactly what Naomi had observed. The acquisition remained financially sound, but the original offer would have overestimated future returns by enough to weaken the company's negotiating position. One board member, Margaret Collins, who had served on corporate boards for nearly 3 decades, folded her reading glasses and looked directly at Naomi. How did you recognize that so quickly? She asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. Naomi answered without hesitation. I have always found that numbers tell stories. When one part of the story sounds different from the rest, I look until I understand why. Another director smiled politely. That is an interesting way to describe financial modeling. Naomi gave a small nod. It works for recipes, schedules, budgets, and business plans. Patterns usually stay consistent until something interrupts them. Several people exchanged thoughtful glances. Her explanation contained no technical vocabulary meant to impress anyone. Yet somehow it described the problem more clearly than the complicated discussion that had filled the previous hour. Ethan studied her quietly. Every assumption he had made during lunch now felt strangely incomplete. Earlier that afternoon, he had seen a waitress carrying menus. Now he saw someone who noticed relationships hidden inside information, someone who remained calm under pressure without needing recognition. There was a discipline in her thinking that could not be explained by chance alone. You have seen financial models before, Ethan said, not as an accusation, but as an observation. Naomi paused briefly before answering. Not this one. A faint smile appeared on one director's face. That was not the question. Naomi met Ethan's eyes with the same composed expression she had carried throughout the day. No, she replied gently. It was not. The room waited. No one interrupted. No one rushed her. Outside the windows, late afternoon sunlight reflected across the neighboring buildings, casting long golden lines over the polished conference table. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his tone noticeably different from the confident certainty he had displayed only hours earlier. Then tell us something about yourself. Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment, choosing her words carefully. There is not very much to tell. I work at Hawthorne House because it pays my bills. I enjoy solving problems because they remind me that every difficult situation has an answer if someone is willing to look long enough. She stopped there. She offered no impressive titles, no carefully rehearsed achievements, no attempt to elevate herself in front of the board. Yet the simplicity of her answer seemed to leave a stronger impression than any lengthy introduction could have accomplished. For the first time that afternoon, Ethan realized that the most important information about the woman standing before him was not what she had chosen to reveal. It was what she had quietly decided to keep to herself. The boardroom remained remarkably still after Naomi finished speaking. Nobody seemed eager to return to spreadsheets or projected earnings. The conversation had quietly shifted from numbers to the person who had noticed what everyone else had missed. Ethan walked toward the windows overlooking the city before turning back to face her. His voice was calm, but the certainty that had defined him all afternoon had softened. You said you enjoy solving problems. That kind of thinking usually comes from somewhere. Who taught you? Naomi smiled faintly. Many people did. Some knew they were teaching me. Others never realized it. Several directors leaned forward with genuine interest. Margaret Collins rested her notebook on the table. You never answered the question from lunch, she said gently. Do you have a degree? Naomi looked around the room before responding. Yes, I do. No one spoke. She continued in the same quiet tone. I earned a Bachelor of Science in Applied Mathematics several years ago. I graduated with honors. A few surprised expressions appeared around the table, but Naomi was not finished. After graduation, my mother became seriously ill. Medical appointments, prescriptions, and daily care quickly became more important than interviews or graduate school. I accepted the first steady job that allowed me to support us while keeping a flexible schedule. Hawthorne House gave me that opportunity, and I have always been grateful for it. The room remained silent, not because her story was dramatic, but because it was deeply human. There was no resentment in her voice, no attempt to make anyone feel guilty. She simply described the path life had placed before her. Ethan listened without interrupting. For years he had believed that resumes revealed everything important about a person. Yet the woman standing before him had just reminded him that many stories never reached a resume at all. Margaret slowly smiled. You never stopped thinking like a mathematician. Naomi shook her head politely. Learning does not disappear because your job title changes. One director quietly closed his laptop. Another looked toward the revised financial model on the screen and then back at Naomi. The contrast between appearance and ability suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. Ethan stepped closer. Why did you never mention your education when I questioned you? Naomi answered almost immediately. Because proving someone wrong is rarely as valuable as letting the truth reveal itself. Her words settled over the room with unexpected weight. No one could argue with them. She had not defended herself during lunch. She had not corrected anyone when they underestimated her. She had simply waited until her knowledge became useful to others instead of useful only to her pride. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. The memory of his own question returned with uncomfortable clarity. He had asked it confidently, convinced he already knew the answer. Now he understood that the greatest error had not been asking the question. It had been believing that the uniform in front of him had already answered it. Outside, the afternoon sun continued to sink behind the skyline, casting long reflections across the glass walls of the boardroom, while inside, the quietest person in the building had completely changed the way its most powerful leaders looked at the people around them. No one seemed interested in ending the meeting anymore. The acquisition could wait another few minutes because something far more valuable had entered the room. It was perspective. Ethan slowly walked back to his chair, but remained standing behind it, resting one hand lightly on the polished wood. He looked around the table before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology." The words were simple, yet they carried enough sincerity to silence the room once again. Ethan turned toward Naomi. "When we met this afternoon, I believed I understood who you were before I knew anything about you. I judged your profession instead of your character, and I judged your uniform instead of your ability. That was my mistake." Naomi listened quietly without interrupting. She offered the same calm expression she had worn since the beginning of the day. "Thank you," she replied. "That means more than you probably realize." Ethan gave a small nod before continuing. "For years I have encouraged everyone in this company to challenge assumptions. Today I realized I failed to challenge one of my own." Several board members exchanged thoughtful smiles. Margaret Collins spoke next. "The strongest organizations are not built by people who never make mistakes. They are built by people willing to recognize them." Heads nodded around the table. The atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier, titles had defined every voice in the room. Now respect had become the only qualification anyone seemed to notice. Ethan looked toward the revised financial model still displayed on the screen. "Because you spoke up, we are walking into tomorrow's negotiation with a more accurate understanding of the numbers. That will affect every decision we make." Naomi answered gently. "I am glad it helped." Ethan hesitated for a brief moment before asking another question. "Have you ever considered returning to mathematics professionally?" Naomi smiled, but there was no regret behind it. "Every day, life simply asked something different from me first." Ethan understood immediately. Success had taught him to appreciate determination, but her answer reminded him that responsibility often shaped lives more powerfully than ambition. Daniel, who had quietly remained near the doorway throughout the conversation, looked at Naomi with unmistakable pride. He had always known she possessed unusual discipline. He simply had never imagined the entire board of Whitmore Dynamics would discover it in a single afternoon. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a business card embossed with the company logo. He placed it gently on the conference table rather than handing it to her directly. "Whether you choose to call me or not is entirely your decision," he said. "This is not an obligation. It is simply an invitation to continue a conversation that should have begun differently." Naomi looked at the card for a moment before picking it up with quiet appreciation. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I will think about it." Ethan smiled for the first time that day. Not the confident smile of a chief executive closing another successful deal, but the humble smile of someone who had learned an unexpected lesson. Around the boardroom, no one mentioned degrees anymore. No one mentioned uniforms. The only thing anyone seemed to remember was the quiet courage it had taken for one thoughtful waitress to trust the truth more than the opinions of the people standing in front of her. When the meeting finally came to an end, no one hurried toward the elevators the way they usually did after a long afternoon of negotiations. Board members gathered their folders more slowly than before, exchanging thoughtful glances instead of confident predictions about the market. The revised financial model had already been approved, and the acquisition would move forward with stronger numbers and greater confidence. Yet the spreadsheets were no longer what anyone remembered most about the day. Ethan remained near the conference table as the room gradually emptied. Before Naomi reached the doorway, he spoke one last time. "Ms. Brooks." She turned with the same quiet composure that had carried her through every unexpected moment since lunch. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." He walked toward her without the distance that had separated them only a few hours earlier. "Whether you decide to continue serving guests at Hawthorne House or pursue another path, I hope you never allow anyone to convince you that your value depends on whether they recognize it." Naomi smiled warmly. "I learned a long time ago that recognition arrives on its own schedule. Character has to arrive on mine." Ethan nodded slowly. There was nothing to add. Some lessons became complete the moment they were spoken aloud. Daniel thanked the catering staff before everyone prepared to leave. As Naomi collected the empty coffee cups one final time, several directors quietly thanked her as well. Their gratitude sounded genuine because it was no longer directed toward the waitress who had served refreshments. It was offered to the thoughtful woman who had helped them see beyond their own assumptions. The following morning, news of the successful negotiations spread throughout Whitmore Dynamics. Employees celebrated another important milestone, unaware that the strategy presented to investors had changed because of one observation made by someone whose name appeared nowhere on the organizational chart. Ethan carried that realization with him through every meeting that followed. Weeks later, he introduced a simple practice across the company. During major planning sessions, every participant, regardless of position or title, would be encouraged to ask questions before final decisions were made. He explained only one reason. Fresh eyes often notice what experienced eyes expect to see. The policy quickly became part of the company's culture. Nobody outside the boardroom knew exactly what had inspired it, and Ethan never felt the need to explain. Some stories created their greatest impact when they remained quietly personal. As for Naomi, life did not transform overnight. She continued greeting guests with kindness, remembering names, serving meals with care, and treating every customer with the same respect she had always offered. The business card remained safely tucked inside a small notebook she carried each day, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that dignity never depended on another person's opinion. It depended on remaining faithful to who she already was. Sometimes she looked at the Manhattan skyline through the restaurant windows and smiled softly before returning to work. She understood something that many people spent their entire lives chasing. The world often notices confidence first, but it remembers quiet integrity much longer. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson hidden inside an ordinary afternoon. A title can open a door. A uniform can shape a first impression. But neither one has the power to define a human being. Respect begins the moment we choose to see the person before we see the position, because the quietest voice in the room may already be carrying the wisdom everyone else has been searching for.